This story's pretty detailed, so I'm gonna get right into it. Only relevant details though. I'm 22 years old, freshly graduated from college. Since I was maybe 3 or 4, my family's lived in a 3-story home in a relatively nice area. If you're picturing the quintessential suburban neighborhood, you've got the right idea. As for the layout of the house, this is all you need to know. My bedroom, which is on the 2nd floor, has a window that faces the street, and the only window in my dad's home office, which is on the 3rd floor, also faces the street. That's it. The reason I'm writing this is because after the events of last week, I'm now 100% convinced something sinister is happening to my family for some inexplicable reason I can't even begin to conceive of. And if I'm connecting the dots correctly, which I'm pretty sure I am, it's been going on for years. This first relevant thing happened so long ago that I don't even remember how old I was, but I was young enough to still be in middle school, so it had to have been at least 10 years ago. It was either a Saturday or a Sunday since I didn't have school, and as I was walking downstairs for breakfast, I overheard my parents talking in the kitchen. I didn't catch much of the conversation, but I was able to hear my dad talking about how something had happened again, and it must have been at least a little concerning judging by the tone he was using. My parents didn't tell me what was going on when I asked them about it. They actually didn't tell me directly for over a year afterwards, but I learned the real story a few days later from my older brother. My dad's a lawyer and often works into the night whenever he's pressured to finish something that doesn't get done at the office, and that's what he was doing until about 2 a.m. the night before I overheard him talking to my mom about the incident. According to my dad, he was working away at his desk at around midnight when he noticed a Chevy Suburban drive down the street at like 5 miles per hour. That's not an exaggeration. He claims to this day that the car looked like it was crawling down the street, as if someone had taken their foot off both the gas and the brake and was just letting the car idle forward. My dad didn't think much of it until he saw the exact same car drive back down the street, only this time in the opposite direction. And then, even more strangely, the car actually parked across the street, right in front of our house. My dad didn't take his eye off the car for a good few minutes straight, waiting to see whether someone would get out of the car or if it would drive off. But neither happened. The car just sat there. My dad didn't have the time or the patience to devote the rest of the night to watching the car, so he went back to work, glancing out the window every so often out of curiosity. But nothing happened for hours. He swore no one ever got out of the car, since he would have noticed movement out the window if they had. Eventually, he fell asleep at his desk around 2 a.m. without even completing his work. But here's the crazy part. When he woke up around 5:30, the car was still there in the exact same spot. What happened while he was asleep remains a mystery, but my dad said he was so shocked to see the car still there when he woke up, he thought he was dreaming. The car ended up leaving before sunrise, and even after finishing his work, my dad was so unsettled he couldn't sleep. I would eventually learn that this wasn't the first instance of something similar happening, that my dad had seen cars drive back and forth on our street late at night before, but it was definitely the strangest. No one in the family really thought anything of it for several years though. It was most likely just someone sleeping in a very coincidental spot, and at the very worst, it was someone driving around random nice neighborhoods and casing houses. Fast forward a few years. I'm 15 now, a sophomore in high school. I remember the second occurrence much more distinctly, partly because it was more recent and partly because it actually happened to me. I was up late making beats in my room, something I did quite often during that time in my life. Like I said earlier, my room has a window that faces the street, which I can always see out of since my desk is right in front of it. I was vibing out with my headphones in when something from outside my bedroom window caught my eye. It was a little flicker of light, definitely unnatural and definitely not my imagination. I diverted my attention to the window and saw the strangest, most unsettling thing. There was a squadron of cars, at least 3 of them. They were driving down the street at a slow speed. That by itself doesn't sound so bad, but I quickly realized that the people in the cars were shining flashlights at houses. That's what the flicker of light had been. I kept watching in this state of confused angst as whoever was in the first car swept their flashlight beam across the house next to mine. Then they started shining their light at my house, and I actually ducked down underneath my windowsill when I realized the beam was about to sweep right past my window. Not 2 seconds after ducking down, I watched the flashlight beam illuminate my ceiling for a couple seconds before everything went dark again. I waited a good 20 seconds before re-emerging, and by the time I did, the cars were much further down the street. I watched as they got to the end of the street and turned off. You can probably imagine how I was feeling in that moment. It was tough to get much sleep after that. I obviously told my parents about it the next morning, and as a family, we collectively agreed that it was a group of thugs casing houses, probably looking for ones with no one home that would make easy targets for a home intrusion. My dad installed a Ring camera after that, and he even put some security cameras with motion lights in our backyard. I can't remember for sure, but I think my parents might have talked to a few of our neighbors to see if anyone had experienced something similar. A couple years later, the next thing happened. While doing some landscaping in our backyard, one of the contractors my dad had hired claimed to have found a small hidden camera tucked into one of the bushes near the fence. It was tiny, no bigger than a car key, but it was definitely a camera. It was battery powered, and the battery had long since died. It didn't have a SIM card or any memory card inside, which meant it wasn't storing anything locally or using cellular data. But that didn't rule out the possibility that it had been streaming footage to an external device nearby while it was active. My dad said the most likely explanation was that someone had been parked close enough to receive a live feed until the battery gave out. Why anyone would go through the trouble of hiding something like that on our property and then just leave it behind was a complete mystery to us, but it definitely wasn't the kind of thing that you stumble across by accident. As furious as my dad was, he couldn't figure out when or who had placed it there, even after combing through the last few months of security camera footage, or at least everything the thing had recorded and stored. I was convinced that one of my friends had been pranking us, but even after pestering all of them, no one fessed up to placing that camera there. My parents were really worried we were being targeted, and they even reported everything to the police, but the home security they had already installed was pretty top-notch, so it wasn't like they could upgrade things much. Nothing happened for a little while after that. It wasn't like there was this cloud hanging over our heads. We all just kind of moved on with our lives the way most people probably would. The next thing worth mentioning happened a few years after we discovered the camera. Our immediate next-door neighbors moved away, and their house was re-inhabited super quickly, like it was only vacant for a few weeks at most. That's not exactly the most unusual thing. My neighborhood has always been a very desirable place for families to live. However, I noticed pretty quickly that the people who moved in weren't parents, just a youngish couple with no children. I remember finding that odd considering the size of the house, but I assumed maybe they were planning on starting a family, or maybe they just wanted a big place all to themselves. On several occasions after they moved in though, I caught them looking into our yard through their top floor window, always at strange hours, either really early in the morning or really late at night. At first, I figured they had a workstation or office up there like my dad, and they were just seated right in front of the window. But then I noticed they were always standing, which eliminated the desk hypothesis. I knew I was just being paranoid, but I'm a pretty observant person by nature, so if someone's gonna do something out of the ordinary, I'm gonna notice it. Either way, I didn't think much of it, just found it mildly amusing that our neighbors seemed fascinated with the layout of our yard or whatever else it was that they were always looking at. One night, while walking my dog on the street, I couldn't help but notice my neighbors in their kitchen through their big bay window. They were sitting at a table, and for the first time since they had moved in, there was a third person with them. The guy had really distinctive features. He was fully bald, really muscular, and had the thickest eyebrows I'd ever seen. The three of them, he and the couple, were just sitting and talking at the table, nothing unusual. But as if they noticed me looking, the woman swiftly walked over to the window and pulled the curtains over it. She didn't actually look out the window at me, none of them did, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she shut the curtains because somehow she knew I was watching. Either way, I didn't forget about the man that had been with them. His face was just so distinctive. I don't really know what else to say. Okay, so now that you've made it this far, you're probably thinking that I'm some paranoid schizophrenic. I mean, that's what I'd be thinking too. but I would never in a million years be sending the story in if what happened next didn't happen. Like I said in the beginning, this happened last week, so about another few years after the last thing I talked about. A few weeks ago, my family took a trip to Paris. My older brother had been dating his girlfriend for years, and everyone was pretty much expecting him to propose while we were there because we were going with her family too. A few days into the trip, we were at this random bar. Everyone was there, me, my parents, my brothers, his girlfriend, and her parents. We were sitting in a booth enjoying a few drinks and having some good conversation. I was maybe halfway through my drink, zoning out of the conversation, when I happened to glance across the room. There was this guy sitting alone in a booth, just casually sipping his drink and looking around the room. Something about him seemed familiar, but I couldn't immediately place where I'd seen him before. But then, like a light switch had been turned on, I realized it was that man who I'd seen at my neighbor's kitchen table years ago. There was no way. I didn't want to believe it. What were the chances this random guy from my neighborhood would be in the exact same bar as my family in a foreign country, no less? I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, but the more I stared, the more certain I became that it was him. Then he caught me looking at him. We locked eyes for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. He knew, I knew, and he knew I knew. I could feel it. Then, without finishing his drink or paying his bill, he got up and walked out of sight. I immediately excused myself from the table and tried to follow him, but I couldn't figure out where he had gone. I ended up just sitting back down at the table, trying to suppress the nasty feeling I had. Telling myself that the guy just happened to be on vacation the same time we were was the only way I could continue my night with my sanity. A few days later, we were doing some typical touristy stuff. It was broad daylight, and we were just walking around the city when I saw him again, that same guy. I can't understate how shocking it was. If the first instance had just been a coincidence, this completely shattered that theory. He was standing maybe 50 feet from us, snapping pictures with a professional-looking camera. I couldn't tell for sure, but it kind of seemed like the camera was pointed in our direction, even though there was a famous monument behind us. I watched as he then turned a corner and disappeared out of sight. I finally told my parents about what was going on. I gave them every little detail and assured them I wasn't going crazy. My parents actually believed me, my dad especially, and he even suggested cutting the trip short. We didn't end up doing that, but the rest of the vacation was awful. When we finally got home, my dad checked as much security footage as was stored, but didn't find anything. I really don't know what to make of all of this. I don't know what these people want from us, or who they even are, but now I'm convinced they've been watching us for over a decade, which sounds insane, and I only have reason to believe things are going to escalate from here. I live near Angeles National Forest. I've been hiking those trails for years, and I know them well enough that I don't really worry about getting lost or anything like that. I'm comfortable out there. The night this all went down, I'd gotten some bad news over the phone earlier in the day. It was the kind of news that makes you feel like you need to get out of the house and clear your head. Some people drink when they're upset, some people call a friend. I go for a hike. It was around 8 when I set out. I wasn't planning anything ambitious. Just wanted to clear my head, maybe tire myself out enough so that I could actually sleep when I got back. Night hikes aren't unusual for me, especially on trails I know well. There's something about being out there in the dark that usually feels meditative. The fog that night was something else though. I had checked the weather before leaving, but conditions at elevation are always a gamble. By the time I was a little ways in, visibility had dropped to maybe 20 feet. Everything beyond that was just gray. I tried using my flashlight at first, but the beam just bounced back at me off the moisture in the air. It actually made things worse, like trying to drive with your high beams on in a snowstorm. So I mostly kept it off, letting my eyes adjust to what little ambient light filtered through. I had music playing to deter any animals from bothering me, which was something I picked up from my dad. About an hour in, I noticed a smell. It was faint at first, and I actually stopped walking for a second because it caught me so off guard. It didn't smell like natural wood smell. It kind of smelled like perfume, which I know sounds absurd, but that's genuinely what it smelled like. It wasn't strong or overwhelming, just this distinct floral scent that had no business being out there. I looked around, which was pointless because I couldn't see anything anyway, and by the time I'd finished scanning the fog, the smell was gone. I didn't really know what to make of it, so I just brushed it off. About 10 minutes later, though, there was a new smell. This time, it was something a little more familiar. Campfire. So I instantly connected the dots. There was someone camping somewhere out there, and that also probably explained the perfume smell. But the smell was only there for about 30 seconds before vanishing, which was a little strange. It wasn't until smelling the third smell that I thought something was really off. It was this herbal, almost earthy scent that I immediately recognized from my childhood but couldn't place. The familiarity of it, combined with how completely out of context it was, unsettled me. I probably should have turned around the moment things felt off, but I kept hiking. Things were normal for a while, and I started feeling better about everything. But as soon as I felt even the slightest sense of calm, I noticed a flashlight beam on the ridge to my left. The ridge runs parallel to the main trail, but sits maybe 100 feet higher, and there are no marked trails or access points up there, which I know for a fact because I've looked at maps plenty of times, wondering if there was a way to get up. The terrain is too dangerous. You'd also have to bushwhack through some seriously nasty stuff to reach that elevation from where I was. And yet, there was clearly someone up there. The beam would turn on, sweep across a section of the ridge, then turn off, and then a few seconds later, it would turn on again somewhere else. In that very moment, I realized listening to music was now a huge liability, so I turned the music off and listened. Whoever was up there was whistling, which sounds normal enough, but it really freaked me out. If I could hear them whistling, they would have definitely heard the music I was just playing. At that point, I was several miles into the trail. The smart thing would still have been to turn around, but I didn't want to. There was a little overlook spot up ahead that I knew about, so I told myself I'd take a break there and think things through. But as soon as I made it there, I saw something that made everything about 100 times worse. There was a stone sculpture sitting on a flat rock near the edge of the overlook. I knew what that meant. I instantly stood up, turned around, and started walking back the way I had come. But out of nowhere, I heard rapid footsteps approaching me in the direction I was walking. It was unmistakable, 100% a person's footsteps, not an animal's. I didn't even have time to think. The footsteps were so close that all I could do was hold my ground and prepare for an altercation. I didn't even have time to run, but as soon as the footsteps were right on me, they just abruptly stopped. It was really, really scary. I kept staring into the fog, but I couldn't see anything. Part of me thought whoever had just charged me was now standing still, somewhere out of my field of view, but that didn't make any sense. If I couldn't see them, how in the world did they know where I was? I waited another few seconds and then pulled out the switchblade I always kept for protection. I kept holding my ground, just waiting to see or even hear something, waiting to be attacked. But now it was just dead silence. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to announce my presence, but I was pretty sure whoever was out there already knew I was there. The thing that made it so much worse was that the footsteps had come from the direction I needed to go to get back. There was no alternate route. If I wanted to leave, I had to walk directly toward where those footsteps had come from. I tried to hold out, but I couldn't wait there forever, so I started moving. I was fully expecting to see someone eventually, at which point I don't even know what I would have done. But the further into the fog I went, the more I started thinking that whoever had been there somehow ran off without me hearing them. The paranoia was excruciating. Every few minutes or so, I swore I heard one or two extra footsteps, like someone was matching my pace from behind now. I kept looking over my shoulder, but there was nothing but fog every time. That lasted for about a mile or so. It was genuinely the most tense mile of my life. I was being stalked. I was certain of it. Out of nowhere, something crashed through the bushes somewhere behind me. It was so loud that I physically jumped. This time I couldn't control myself. I yelled something out as a pure, terrified reaction. I turned around to the spot where the noise had come from, but again, I couldn't see anything. At that point, I genuinely felt like I was going to lose my life in that forest, so I started running. I don't know why it took me so long to run, but the moment I started running, I didn't stop until I made it all the way back to my car. And the whole time, I heard crashing coming from somewhere behind me. I was definitely being chased, but I didn't care. I still consider it a miracle that I made it back to my car in one piece. I didn't hike for months after this experience, and I never got an answer for what happened that night. This happened close to 20 years ago, back when I was 15. My parents were in the midst of a really ugly divorce at the time, and my mom thought it would be a good idea for me to spend a few weeks with my great aunt Lucy in upstate Vermont while they sorted out the legal stuff. I wasn't thrilled about being shipped off to some relative I barely knew, but I didn't have much choice. Aunt Lucy lived in this massive Victorian house that had been converted into apartments sometime in the 60s. She owned the whole building and rented out the top 2 floors to tenants, while she lived alone in the sprawling first floor unit. The place was beautiful in a very specific old-fashioned way. High ceilings, original hardwood floors, intricate moldings around every door frame, movie-type stuff like that. What struck me as odd right away was that Aunt Lucy seemed to avoid certain parts of her own apartment. She had this huge master bedroom with tall windows and beautiful antique furniture, but she slept in a small den off the living room instead. That was actually one of the things I asked her about, to which she just replied that the main bedroom got too much morning light. I then stupidly asked if I could sleep in there then, to which she just glared at me disapprovingly. You gotta remember that things were a little different back then, and respecting your elders was practically law. So after that interaction, I held my tongue, not wanting to upset her further. The first few nights I was there, I kept hearing what sounded like someone walking around in the apartment above us. I figured it was just one of the tenants, maybe someone who worked late shifts. But the weird thing was how methodical the walking sounded, back and forth, like someone pacing the length of the apartment. After about a week of this, I couldn't keep things to myself and mentioned it to Aunt Lucy over breakfast. She again gave me this strange expression and said the second floor had been vacant for over a month. I insisted that I'd been hearing someone walking around up there every night, but she just shook her head and told me I was just hearing the building settling. Her explanation didn't make sense, but I wasn't about to argue. The next morning, I told Aunt Lucy I wanted to see the vacant apartment. She seemed reluctant, but I kept pressing, and eventually she agreed. Just like she said, the second floor was completely empty, but as we walked through the rooms together, I saw something that immediately validated what I'd been hearing. There were fresh scuff marks on the hardwood floors, like someone had been walking the same path over and over. The marks formed a clear pattern from the front of the apartment to the back, exactly matching the route the footsteps seemed to make each night. When I pointed this out, Aunt Lucy said the marks were probably from the previous tenants, but they looked too recent for that. I told her this, but she just dismissed me like I was some babbling child. That evening, she suggested we watch a movie together, which we'd never done before. As it got later, the footsteps from upstairs started up again. I looked at Aunt Lucy, expecting her to finally acknowledge what we were hearing, but instead, she just turned the volume up and pretended like nothing was happening. I was stunned. My first thought was Aunt Lucy knew exactly what was going on and just didn't want to tell me. The next day, I called my mom and mentioned the situation, and you know what's crazy? Even my mom seemed to know what was going on. She told me not to bring up the footsteps with Aunt Lucy anymore, and that it was, quote, a sensitive topic. One night near the end of my visit, I woke up around 2 a.m. needing to use the bathroom. As I was walking back to my room, I glanced toward the staircase that led up to the second floor. The door at the bottom was slightly ajar, and I could have sworn I saw a faint light moving around up there, like someone was walking with a flashlight. I immediately went to bed and didn't mention it to Aunt Lucy. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. If it hadn't been for that night the two of us watched a movie, I would have assumed Aunt Lucy was causing the footsteps, but that was impossible. My mom refused to explain things to me when I got back home, and this actually caused quite the rift between the two of us. Years later, I found out through a cousin that Aunt Lucy had sold the building and moved to Florida. According to my cousin, there had been some kind of incident in the apartment back in the 90s. Someone had died there under unclear circumstances, and the family had tried to keep it quiet. That was also around the time Aunt Lucy had inherited the building. I've never believed in ghosts. I don't say that to sound dismissive or close-minded. I just genuinely don't. I think that's a pretty dumb way to interpret things you don't understand, to be frank. So when I think back on what I experienced in that house, I always find myself searching for some other explanation. Maybe Aunt Lucy was sheltering someone up there, a relative in trouble, or someone who needed to stay hidden. Or maybe she was being blackmailed, forced to let someone live in her building without anyone knowing. Maybe the incident my cousin mentioned wasn't as closed as the family wanted to believe, and whoever was responsible still had some kind of hold over her. Or maybe the entire thing was completely made up, and my cousin was needlessly gossiping. I really don't know. What I do know is that my mom knows something, and I'll never forgive her for withholding that information from me. I think this is just one of those things that will never have an explanation. My dream was always to get my own place ever since I was in high school. I really couldn't wait to move out because I hated my dad growing up and my mom wasn't much better. We would always buck heads and my dad would always be drunk on the weekends, and honestly, it was just a mess. As I got older and girls obviously became a factor, it became even more of a problem because there was no way I'd bring any girls back to that household. So because of all of this, I took the first chance I could get and moved out when I was 19 in college. I didn't go away to school. I went to a commuter college not far from home. My parents wouldn't pay for me to go away to school. So I was on Zillow, Facebook, and Craigslist every day for a while, and when I finally found a rental that looked promising and affordable, I went to see it right away. The layout is pretty important, so I'll describe it now. As I walked in, I was welcomed with the living room/dining room area, which was one open space. Then there was the kitchen adjacent to that, which was separated by a wall. Then, to get to the single bedroom in the apartment, you went down the hallway, which also had two closets. One which I used as a pantry and one as a storage closet, and then the door to the bathroom. At the end of the hall was the bedroom. The bedroom was generously sized. It fit a queen-sized bed easily. It had two more closets, and I fit a couple of dressers and a TV in there easily. I was sold immediately, especially because it was budget-friendly. I moved in the next month, and life was fine. Fast forward a few months maybe. I went out with friends in town, and we ran into some girls we knew. I ended up taking this girl home that I'd known for a while through school, but we'd never hung out in that way. I'll just call her Sammy. We ended up drinking at my place and watching a movie, but that was really all we did. She didn't want to take it further than that on our first time hanging out, and I respected that. We ended up in the bedroom finishing the movie that we started in the living room, and I think we both just passed out from being drunk somewhere through the movie. The next thing that happened was I woke up to footsteps outside in the hallway. It was still the middle of the night. I looked to my side, and I was alone in the bed. I jumped out of bed looking down the hallway, and I saw Sammy in the living room grabbing her stuff off the couch, but she was doing so quietly. She was trying to leave now to avoid the awkwardness in the morning, and I understood that. So I didn't say anything and went back to bed quietly. I heard her eventually walk out the front door. For good measure, I called out, "Sammy?" to no response, and that confirmed she was gone. I got comfortable in bed relatively quickly and drifted back off to sleep. It was probably another hour that passed when I woke to something loud. I immediately shot up in my bed and my heart started pounding relatively quickly. I called out, "Sammy?" again. There was no response. I was honestly kind of scared to get up and check, so I picked up my phone and texted Sammy's number asking if she was still in my house. I realized that was a little weird to do, but I was actually scared in that moment. I looked at the door, which was still open because I was too lazy to get up and shut it after Sammy left. I was definitely still a little drunk from the shots we were taking in the living room, but I felt like I saw something wrapped around the door frame. My breathing only intensified. I still can't believe I had the balls to do this, but I swiped down on my iPhone to reveal the control panel thing, and I pressed the flashlight button. And with the phone still pointed at the door frame, I realized there were 2 hands wrapped around the door frame. But as if responding immediately to being revealed, whoever's hands they were tightened and then pulled back out of sight. And the scream I was holding in for those 3 seconds finally came out. Mixed with simply screams of dread, I also screamed, get out, over and over. By the time I finally got up, I looked down the hallway, and it looked empty. I flipped on the light immediately. After a few minutes of calming my breathing and just trying to listen for sounds, I built up the courage to check the hallway closets and bathroom, and they were clear. I then moved to the main living area, and trust me, there weren't any places to hide in there. I held my phone as if it were a gun as I crept to the nearest light switch and turned it on. I felt instantly better when the living space was lit up, but there was still the kitchen. I crept to the opening that led to the kitchen and flicked that light on as well, finally lighting up the entire apartment. There was no one here. I looked behind the couch, I looked under the tables, I even checked the floor-level kitchen cabinets. When I realized it was clear, I ran to the front door to lock it. The weird thing, though, was that I never heard the front door close, and yet there was not a single soul except for me in there. I now tried calling Sammy repeatedly until she picked up. When she did, she sounded tired and confused. I asked her if she was just in my house, and she told me she left a while ago because she couldn't sleep. I didn't explain. I just told her my bad. I thought I heard a noise, and then we hung up. I decided to spam call my best friend until he picked up, also sounding tired and confused. I explained everything that just went down, and he said he could tell I was still drunk. His explanation calmed me down, though. He said I was sleep-deprived and still drunk, and I had a mid-wake-up hallucination. It made a little sense, actually, considering I never heard the front door shut. I eventually could laugh it off and apologized for waking him up. I went back to my room, shut and locked the door, and I actually calmed myself down enough to fall asleep. The next morning, I did another search around the apartment, and it was without a doubt clear. So I went on with my day. But at some point, I thought back to that supposed hallucination I had of those hands wrapped around the doorframe the night before. I walked to my room and examined the doorframe, and I think my heart stopped for a moment when I saw obvious fingerprints left in the exact positions the hands I saw on the doorframe had been. I felt dizzy, coming to the realization that it wasn't a hallucination. I took this picture of it, which I still have in my iCloud years later. I resorted to calling my dad for advice, and he more or less called me a buffoon for not locking the door, but as long as nothing was stolen and no one was there anymore, take it as a valuable learning lesson. Honestly, nothing my dad said on that phone call was untrue. That's what sucks. I don't know who the hell came into my apartment that night, and I don't know why they chose to do the literal creepiest thing they could have possibly done. But after my year-long lease was up, I moved on and upgraded apartments and never looked back. My parents' house never really felt like a parent's house. Not in the normal way, at least. My dad traveled for work constantly, and my mom was always out with friends or staying over my aunt's house, or doing something else where she'd come home late or not at all. I know that sounds kind of messed up, but it was just the reality. It wasn't like they abandoned me or anything. It was more like they were always busy and always somewhere else. So from the time I was like 16 and up, I basically lived alone. I ate dinner alone most nights, I watched TV alone, I'd be the only person in the house for an entire weekend sometimes. I'm an only child, and I think that's because my parents realized after having me how much they valued their own freedom. So in that regard, I did suffer, which is something I feel more now as an adult. When I was younger, I used to love it because it felt like freedom having such a big place to myself. I could do whatever I wanted without my parents breathing down my neck, and I didn't have to share it with siblings. I could bring friends over and play games late. I could talk to girls on the phone without being embarrassed. It felt like having my own home without paying for it. And even when I turned 19 and started going to a nearby college, nothing changed. If anything, it got even more like that. My mom and dad were gone or out more, and I was basically just holding it down at home. I knew every noise that house made too. That part matters because it wasn't one of those houses where every creak freaked you out. It was an older but larger house, and it had its usual sounds. I always just said the damn place had character. So this happened on a night where I knew for a fact I was going to be alone. My dad was out of town for work, and my mom had been talking all week about how she was staying at my aunt's because they were having some big family thing the next day, and she didn't want to drive back late. I remember her telling me, "It's just you tonight," and I honestly didn't even care. That was normal. I told her that she didn't even have to tell me that. I made food, I watched TV, I did the usual. At around 11, I went upstairs to my room and started watching YouTube videos in bed, something I do some nights for hours. My room was at the end of the hallway upstairs. At the top of the stairs, you'd have a small landing, and then to the right was my parents' room, and further down the hallway was the bathroom, the linen closet, and then my room at the end. I had my door open because my parents told me to keep doors open at night, more as a staying alert and listening for intruders type of thing. But I also liked hearing the house a little, like background noise. It made the whole being alone thing feel less intense. I eventually started getting tired, so I shut my laptop and just laid there scrolling on my phone. So I'm gonna just say that probably an hour passed from the moment I shut my laptop to when my phone rang. It said no caller ID on the screen. That was the first time I'd ever received a no caller ID phone call. I stared at it for a second. To be receiving that late at night was sketchy as hell. I ignored it, but it rang again right after, still saying no caller ID. That's what made me answer. I figured if it was someone important, they would call twice. Plus, it's just a phone call. Worst case scenario, I hang up. So I picked up, and at first, there was no noise. I got nervous that it was one of those scam calls that calls to see if a number is active to add it to some call center database. But then I started hearing something faint, and it took my brain a second to process what it even was. It sounded like a TV playing in the background, and what was weird was that I could also faintly hear my own TV downstairs through the door, because earlier I guess I left it on in the living room. I didn't have it on loud, just on low volume as background noise. So hearing TV audio on the phone instantly made my stomach tighten. I said hello a second time, to once again no response, just the TV sound, like whoever was on the other end wasn't even trying to speak. It was just there. Then I realized something that made me sit up in bed instantly. The TV noise I was hearing through the phone wasn't random. It matched my TV downstairs, like perfectly. It wasn't delayed, it was the exact same audio at the exact same moments, like it was synced. That's when I got this cold feeling down my spine, because there's only one way that makes sense. That would mean whoever was on the phone could hear my TV in real time, as in, they were inside my house downstairs. I tried to force a normal explanation, like it was a friend standing outside one of my windows downstairs trying to trick me. Or maybe the call was somehow glitching and picking up on my microphone audio. That can happen, but the more I listened, the more I realized that didn't make sense. It sounded like someone was calling me while standing somewhere in my living room. I got up and walked to my bedroom door and listened. And oh yeah, I was 1,000,000% sure now that the audio on the phone was syncing to the TV. In hindsight, this was dumb, but I screamed out, "Who's down there?" Because in the back of my mind, I thought for sure I knew it was a friend or family member pulling something. And then, the line went dead. They hung up. By this point, my mouth went completely dry. I couldn't even call the number back because it was an anonymous call. I walked out into the hallway towards the stairs, and I looked down. I still heard the TV on in the living room, and then a creak. It sounded like the wood floor cracking from the pressure of a person, but if that didn't confirm things, the moment I heard someone clearing their throat downstairs. That's when everything instantly became 10 times more real. I could no longer lean on the glitching phone theory, even though deep down I already knew that was BS anyway. I went to my room and quietly closed and locked the door. What if my dad was testing me, seeing how I'd react in a home intrusion situation, or maybe my Uncle T? So I called my dad, but he didn't pick up. He may have already been asleep. It was like 11:30. So I called again and again, but no luck. I tried my luck with Uncle T, and he picked up on the second ring. I could tell he was in bed. He asked why I was calling, and I prefaced the phone call telling him this might sound crazy, and then dropped the bomb and asked if he was downstairs. I remember vividly his exact response and tone as he said, "Steve, what the hell are you talking about?" When I elaborated, he told me that's definitely something his brother would do. His brother, aka my dad. While we were on the phone, my phone started vibrating. I looked at the screen, and it was the no caller ID on the screen again. I begged my Uncle T to stay on the line real quick. I was putting him on hold as I picked up. He said okay, so I picked up the other call. As I said hello, there was the same silence. This time, I didn't hear the TV sounds on the other end. What did that mean? It seemed they had the phone on speaker because I could hear their footsteps. They were moving, and the footsteps were matching the footsteps I suddenly started hearing outside of my bedroom. I prayed with all my heart this was my dad messing with me. Then, my doorknob jiggled, and whoever was on the other side tried pushing the door. Thank God it was an old, heavy door with an old, heavy lock. The sound still synced with what I was hearing on the phone. Whoever was on the other side of the door knocked. I had the sudden thought to merge the two calls, and when I did, I yelled into the phone for my Uncle T, saying, "It's not my dad, get here now." I also yelled that whoever was in the house was also on the phone with us. My uncle seemed to wake up from this, and he started yelling into the phone things like, "I'm coming, you cocksucker." The no caller ID caller hung up the phone, and I heard footsteps move away from the door. This all but confirmed it was in fact not my dad. My uncle told me to stay in the bedroom. He was on his way. I wasn't a little kid, but I wasn't some big brolic man either. I was some skinny 19-year-old. My uncle knew I was in danger. He started heading over to the house. We lived in the same town at the time, but that 7 minutes he took to get to the house was the longest 5 years I'd ever experienced. I heard the familiar voice of my uncle screaming downstairs finally, so I rushed out of the room and downstairs. Having him there made everything feel better. We called the cops together while searching around the house for stolen items. The TV in the living room was still on. Before the cops got to the house, we found the kitchen window to be fully open enough for someone to crawl through. That info was of course relayed to the police, who, when they got there, did what I imagined to be a standard police search of the premises, asking us to lead them around the house, but from behind them. We cleared the whole house, and whoever was in there initially was no longer there. After the cops were done, they asked to see the no-caller ID calls in my recent calls. I showed them, and one of the officers told us that even though it says no-caller ID, sometimes they can still request records and trace it from where it came. They said it could take a few days, but they'd get back to us. My uncle stayed over that night, which made me feel safer. We kept every light on like little kids. A few days later, one of the officers called me back surprisingly. The number was traced back to someone I actually knew. It was an old acquaintance from high school. Not a friend or enemy, but someone who had my number and address and such. I hadn't seen him in years. The cops asked if I wanted to come with them while they questioned him, so my uncle and I went since he was there on the scene with me originally. When the guy's dad answered the door and saw the police, he instantly called his son down without question, and I could see it in his son's face that he was nervous. The officer and I asked him straight up if he made those calls. He immediately said no. Then he said his phone had been stolen a few days ago. He claimed he lost it at a party and never got it back. The cop asked why he didn't report it stolen. He just shrugged it off and said he was going to get a new one anyway. The cop told him they'd follow up if needed, and that was basically it. His dad just stood there the whole time watching, but he weirdly didn't say anything. There was no big gotcha moment or arrest or anything. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The nervous look on his face when he came to the door. Was it a look of guilt, or a natural look anyone would have when being greeted with police on your front doorstep? If it really was a stolen phone, that means someone stole his phone specifically to call me and break into my parents' house. And that's without a doubt scarier than if it was him. It was a weekend like so many before. The usual crew was getting ready to meet up at Cody's house to pregame and go out. This was post-college. We were all 23 to 24 at the time. Cody's house was often the spot to pre- and post-game simply because he had a cool basement where his parents couldn't hear us, but also because his parents were chill. It was just the four of us going out to some local bars tonight: Cody, Randy, Jake, and I. When all four of us were there, we decided on who was calling the Uber, and once we did, we were out of there. Fast forward a few hours at a bunch of dive bars and then a dance bar, and eventually Cody and I decided to go home. We were tired. Randy and Jake were staying out later. Cody called the Uber back, I think, and he offered me the pull-out couch in the basement when we got to his place. He came downstairs with me to help me set it up, and while down there, we played a game of Madden. Honestly, I've always sucked at Madden, so he destroyed me and I didn't want to play again. I was tired and just wanted to sleep the alcohol off before I made the inevitable hangover even worse. Cody went upstairs and shut the door, and I was left alone in the darkness. The only thing that kept that basement from being complete and total blackness were the lights from the cable box clock under the TV, the actual standby light of the TV itself, and a slight green glow from a Heineken mini fridge on the other side of the basement. That mini fridge would also provide some weirdly relaxing white noise that would help me fall asleep. So things faded to black as I knocked out like a baby. A drunk baby. I woke up and it was still dark. I didn't know what time it was, but I knew it was still late at night, or super early, whatever you want to call 3 or 4 a.m. My mouth was so cotton-mouthed dry I could actually barely move my mouth. I stupidly didn't think to bring down a bottle or a glass of water before going to sleep. After drinking all that alcohol, it was no wonder I woke up. I just really didn't want to get up though. It's a very familiar and relatable conflicting feeling that anyone who's woken up hungover and thirsty has felt. I tried to ignore it at first. I rolled over to get a look at the Heineken fridge to see if anything was in there, but it was just alcohol. And then, for whatever reason, my eyes darted to the other corner of the room. I felt like my eyes were playing tricks on me at first, but I could swear I was looking at a black mass in the corner of the room. A black mass that I didn't remember seeing there ever before. I tried to wait for my eyes to adjust better to the dark, expecting the black mass to be some coat on a coat rack or something. But the longer I stared, the more I realized it was moving. It was a person. The amount of restraint I had to not scream was insane. I didn't think it was Cody just based on the sheer height of the mass alone. Without panicking, I had to figure out how to get out of there. After a tense couple of minutes, I sat up and fake yawned as if I was stretching, pretending I didn't notice that person in the corner. I then started fake talking to myself, like muttering complaints about not bringing water down here. Anything to give the appearance that I was oblivious and just going to get water, not run away and alert anyone. I got up and walked closer to the stairs, but also closer to the figure in the corner, and perhaps the most tense moment of my life was when I turned to the right to get to the stairs, and I hoped I wasn't grabbed. When I started going up the stairs, I didn't run or anything. I took it slow and normal to not draw suspicion. But when I was about halfway up, I took a curious glance down the stairs, and that black mass was now at the bottom of the stairs, and I can confirm it was a person. I almost tripped as I started to run up the rest of the stairs and slam the basement door shut. I then started running up the stairs to the upper level of the house to Cody's room, where I shook him awake and yelled at him that there's someone in the basement and that he needs to wake up his dad. And during that commotion, I heard a slam from downstairs. And I yelled, "See?" Cody got up, and we went to his parents' room where we woke up his dad, and I told him there's someone in the basement. He got right out of bed without asking questions and ran down both flights of stairs to the basement, noting that the basement door was wide open. And when I mentioned I shut the basement door, Cody's dad yelled at Cody to call the cops, and he did. We also noticed the back door to the house was now open. So when the three of us were done looking through the basement, we all went to the backyard to search, then the front yard, and then the neighboring yards, all while Cody was still describing what was going on to the 911 operator. I'd say we were searching for 15 minutes before the police finally arrived, and then they did their full search and formally wrote up a report for the incident. By the end of it, there were some neighbors waking up and coming outside asking if everything was okay. By that point, I was sobered up, terrified, and wanted to go home. So as soon as the cops left, I went inside to talk with them for a bit, then I said goodbye and called an Uber home, refusing Cody's offer to drive me home. I worried for them a bit that night, but I was not sleeping in that basement after that. In fact, I never did again. We'd still have pre-games and stuff there, but the feeling in that basement changed for a while after that night, where I'd always glance at that corner of the basement and just think back to that night, that black mass. My name is Thomas. I've been working the late shift at our local Burger King for about 2 years now. It's not glamorous, but it pays rent and the hours work for me. I'm a night owl anyway, so being behind the drive-thru window from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. doesn't bother me the way it would most people. This all started maybe a month ago. I was working the drive-thru solo. We're usually understaffed after midnight, and that's when a car pulled up to the speaker. Male voice, pretty unremarkable. He ordered a large double Whopper with cheese meal with a Coke. It was pretty standard. The one notable thing about the encounter was when he went to pay, he only rolled the window down just enough to slide his card through, and his windows were tinted so I couldn't see his face. He paid and I handed him his receipt, but then he just drove off, like without stopping at the second window to grab his food. I waited there with his bag for a few minutes, wondering if he'd be coming back. Eventually, I just set the order aside and ended up eating it later. People do weird stuff sometimes, so I didn't think about it too much. About a week later, it happened again. It was the same order and the same exact thing happened. Someone paid at the first window and then drove off before picking up the food. I remember thinking, that's strange. Someone did the exact same thing last week. But I wasn't quite able to connect the dots at that point. I just figured it was a coincidence. It wasn't until it happened a third time that I realized it was the same person making these orders. At that point, I knew something weird was going on, but I wasn't going to complain. The food was made, paid for, and I was the one who got to enjoy it, so I kept eating the free Whopper meals and tried not to think too hard about why some random dude was essentially buying me dinner every few days. This went on for a few more weeks. The guy would show up every 4 or 5 days, always late, usually between 1 and 3 a.m., and always with the same order. I started to almost look forward to it in a weird way, like, it's been a few days, wonder if my mysterious benefactor is going to show up tonight. One night, I was working the speaker at around 2 a.m. when I heard that familiar voice through the speaker. I knew what was about to happen, and I was right. He ordered the same meal, which I knew I'd be eating, but this time, he said something else, something that made me freeze up. He said, and I'll never forget this, "I hope you've been enjoying those Whoppers, Mr. Hurley." My last name is Hurley. I don't wear a name tag with my last name on it. It's not posted anywhere customers can see. There's no reason at all that this guy should know my last name. I just stood there for a second, not saying anything. My brain couldn't catch up. Then I started talking into the speaker, asking who this was, what he wanted, and how he knew my name. I must have said "who is this" 4 or 5 times, but he never answered. And this time, he didn't even pull up to pay. I heard his engine rev, and then he was gone. I was rattled for the rest of my shift. There was nothing I could do, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. Little did I know, things were about to get much worse. When I got home after my shift, I found a note on my doorstep. It was a handwritten note that said, "I know what you did. You have 3 days." I just stood there staring at it with my hands shaking, and I started feeling really, really sick, like someone had punched me in the gut. I have no idea what I supposedly did. I've been racking my brain trying to think of anything that could explain this, but I've got nothing. This sounds so stupid, but I don't have enemies or secrets. I'm a 24-year-old guy that works at Burger King and plays video games on his days off. I'm not exactly living the most exciting life. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I just sat on my couch with the lights on, dreading whatever was going to happen next. But nothing happened. I had no choice but to just move on. It turned out I wouldn't have to wait that long, because the next night at work, that guy was back. This time, he didn't even bother playing games. Instead of ordering food, he just asked me to write something down. Then, before I could even respond, he gave me an address. It was some random place on the outskirts of town, in an area I didn't recognize. And then he told me I had 2 days to deliver him $10,000. I damn near laughed at that. I didn't think he was serious, but he clearly wasn't kidding. As soon as he drove off, I immediately went back to being terrified. There was absolutely no way I'd be giving that guy $10,000. I didn't even have $10,000. I still don't. So I decided to ignore it. I figured it had to be some elaborate scam or prank from someone I knew. I should have called the police right then, but I didn't even think of that. 3 nights later, I thought things were over. I hadn't dropped any money off and nothing had happened. But of course, I was wrong. I was sitting there watching TV, winding down from my shift, when out of nowhere, I was jolted up by the sound of shattering glass. I hit the floor on instinct, thinking someone was shooting at me. But when I finally got up and looked around, I realized someone had just thrown a rock through my window. By the time I went to look outside, whoever had been there was long gone. This time, I called the police. I told them everything, including the address I had been given, and they said they'd check it out and told me to stay vigilant. They really didn't do much, they just told me they'd patrol the area a little more closely, and that without any doorstep footage, which I obviously don't have, there was nothing they could do. And that was 3 days ago. I've called in sick to work the last 3 nights, but I don't even think that's going to do anything since the guy clearly knows where I live. I can't afford to not work, and I can't afford to move, so I'm stuck in this nightmare until the police can track that person down. I think I might try getting them to track the credit card number that the guy used to pay for the Whopper meals, but other than that, I'm not really sure what to do. Why I got targeted, I have no idea. Hopefully things don't escalate from here. I graduated from college about 8 months ago with a degree in communications, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, has been incredibly useful in helping me secure gainful employment. That's sarcasm, by the way. I'm still living with my parents, and I haven't been able to find a real job yet, so I'm off to a great start. In the meantime, I drive for Uber and Uber Eats, sometimes both in the same night, depending on what's popping. It's not a career, but it's money, and it lets me feel like I'm doing something productive while I figure my life out. I know that sounds kind of pathetic, but it's what I've got right now. I drive mostly on weekend nights, Friday and Saturday, usually from around 9 p.m. until 2 or 3 in the morning. That's when the surge pricing kicks in and the drunk college kids need rides home from the bars downtown. It's not technically a night shift, but it feels like one. This happened a few weeks ago. It was a Saturday night, maybe around 1:30, and I was about ready to call it. I was about to turn off the app when one more request came through. The pickup was downtown, which was fine, but the drop-off location was really far away, past the suburbs even. I almost declined it for that reason, but the fare was too good. The girl I picked up was completely normal. The drive took about 40 minutes. By the time I dropped her off, it was past 2, and then I was alone, out in the middle of absolutely nowhere with a 40-minute drive back to civilization. I turned the car around and started heading home. Not 10 minutes into the drive, I saw a car stopped in the middle of the road with its hazards on. I approached cautiously, and I realized there were two people standing in front of the car, waving their arms like they were trying to flag me down. My first instinct was actually not to stop, but I'm someone who can't just ignore a person in need. So against my better judgment, I decided to stop. I stopped the car about 20 feet away from them and rolled my window down a few inches. Just enough to hear them, but not enough for someone to reach inside. It was a middle-aged couple, which actually put me at ease a little. That is, until they started talking. The woman did most of the talking. She had this frantic energy about her, but also something that felt slightly rehearsed, like she'd given the speech before. She said they were warning drivers about a collapsed bridge ahead. She went on to say it happened earlier that day, and they'd almost driven right off themselves. She pointed down the road into the darkness and said if I kept going that way, I'd end up in the river. So naturally, I asked them what I should do instead. The husband spoke of a turnoff that was about halfway between where we were and the bridge. He said it cut through the woods and that it would add some time to my drive, but it would get me back to the main highway without having to deal with the bridge. I thanked them and started driving. Something felt off. I didn't know what it was, but I knew one thing. I was going to trust my gut and just drive the way I had been intending to go. About a mile down the road, I saw the turnoff they'd been talking about. It was this narrow dirt path that disappeared into the trees, and it was barely wide enough for one car. I decided to keep driving, and a few minutes later, I reached the bridge. I slowed down a little, but it was fine. It wasn't collapsed for sure, and it didn't even look damaged at all. I drove across it without any issues and made it back to the main highway a few minutes later. Even though nothing happened, the experience stuck with me to the point where I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking about what would have happened if I'd followed that couple's instructions, if I'd turned down that dirt road alone in the middle of the night. A few days later, the curiosity got the better of me and I did something stupid. I drove back out there. It was the middle of the afternoon this time, broad daylight, which made me feel slightly less insane about the whole thing. I retraced my route from that night. Those people weren't there this time, obviously. When I got to the turnoff, that dirt path into the woods, I slowed down and pulled over. To my surprise, there was something new. There was a sign nailed to a tree right at the entrance of the path that simply said, "Dead End." That sign hadn't been there before. I would have definitely noticed it that night, even in the dark. Someone had put it up in the last few days. I sat in my car for a minute, staring at the path. In the daylight, it didn't look quite as ominous. It was just a narrow dirt road that disappeared into some dense trees. I wanted to explore it a little, but I was worried about my car getting stuck, so I decided to go it on foot. I'm not sure what I was expecting to find, but being that there was daylight out, I really wasn't scared at all. I turned off my engine. As soon as I stepped out of the car, though, I got a bad feeling. I stood there at the edge of the path, trying to see further down, but there wasn't much to see really. I don't know what it was, but something about standing there and actually being out in the open discouraged me from walking in. Things went from 0 to 100 in about 2 seconds. As I was turning around and walking back to my car, I heard a scream ring out behind me. It was this awful scream, definitely a woman's, and it came from somewhere deep in the woods down the path. I can't tell you how fast I was out of there. Before I could even think, I was already speeding away. I don't think I've ever been so scared before, and that was about 2 weeks ago. I haven't been back to that spot since, but here's the thing. I can't stop thinking about it. Part of me knows I should just leave it alone, but I've been thinking about asking one of my friends to come out there with me. If I do, I'll record a video and send it, but for now, all I can really do is wonder about that scream and those people. This happened a few winters ago when I was working overnight security for a commercial warehouse complex. I was 26 and had been doing the job for 8 months. The shift ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and I was always the only employee on the site. There was a supervisor I could call if something went wrong, but for the most part, it was just me and the cameras. The complex was in an industrial area on the edge of a small city that didn't have much nightlife. Most nights followed the same routine: clock in, do a walkthrough of the exterior, then settle into the security office to monitor the cameras, and every hour, another patrol. The warehouse stored mostly industrial equipment and bulk supplies, nothing particularly valuable. The night everything went sideways started pretty normally. It was cold enough for there to be snow falling, but nothing too heavy. I did my first patrol, everything was secure, and I went back to the office. Around 1:30 a.m., I got a motion alert on one of the loading dock cameras. This wasn't unusual. The system was sensitive, and wind or animals could trigger it. I pulled out the feed and watched for a minute, but everything looked normal. Just the empty dock and snow drifting past the floodlights. But the alerts kept coming. Every 10 or 15 minutes, the same camera would trigger. Each time I'd check the feed, and each time I'd see nothing. What started to bother me was that the movement always seemed to happen just at the edge of the frame, like something was there but not quite in view. By 2:30, I had maybe 6 or 7 alerts from the same camera. No other cameras were triggering, just that one. At 3 a.m., I went outside to check it myself. The snow had mostly stopped and the complex was dead silent. I walked the full perimeter of the dock area with my flashlight. I didn't see anything unusual. All the bay doors were closed and locked, and there were no footprints in the snow except for mine. I went back inside. About 20 minutes later, I heard a loud, metallic scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across concrete. It came from inside the warehouse, somewhere deep in the building. I checked the interior cameras, but all 6 feeds showed empty aisles. I was starting to freak out a little bit because I started feeling like I was being toyed with or watched somehow. But still, I explained the noise away by chalking it up to the wind or something. An hour later, though, I heard it again. It was louder this time. The dragging sound, followed by a sharp bang, like something had struck one of the interior doors. I cycled through the cameras again. Nothing on 1 through 5. When I got to camera 6, though, the feed was black. Maybe 3 seconds of static, and then it came back. But something was different. The angle had shifted, just a few degrees to the left, like someone had bumped the camera or adjusted its position. At that point, I had no choice. I grabbed my flashlight and radio and headed into the warehouse. The interior was massive, probably 80,000 square feet of industrial shelving arranged in long aisles. During the day, it was bright and full of forklifts. At night, the overhead lights were dimmed to save power, casting everything in this yellowish half light. I was maybe halfway down the main aisle when I heard footsteps coming from somewhere to my left. It definitely sounded like someone, a person walking maybe 2 or 3 aisles over. As soon as I stopped, the footsteps stopped too. I stood there trying to control my breathing. I remember how tense it was, standing there in complete silence, waiting for a sound that I wasn't even sure would come. After what felt like forever, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to break the silence. In a firm voice, I announced my presence as security and insisted that whoever was there make things easy and reveal themselves. But of course, there was no response. The rest of that patrol was utterly terrifying. I was bracing myself for a fight or some kind of confrontation, and the longer I surveyed without finding anyone, the worse that feeling got. But I ultimately finished my patrol without seeing another person, which was arguably worse because I knew with 100% certainty that there was someone in there. I didn't see or hear anything for the rest of my shift, but that didn't make me feel any better. I actually felt somewhat guilty. My job was laughably simple, and I was messing it up in real time. But by the time 7 rolled around, I wanted nothing more than to just get out of there. I reported everything to my supervisor when he showed up on site. Maintenance did a full inspection but didn't find anything either. Even after everything was double and triple checked, no one was able to identify the method of entry, and I could tell people didn't believe my story. Still though, that night remains one of the freakiest things that has ever happened to me. This memory still terrifies me, and outside of police and some close family, this is my first time fully revisiting it. A few years ago, I had gotten my first job at a 24-hour gym. At the time, I was in a gap year between high school and college, so I worked a lot of night shifts. The gym was open 24/7 and accessed by key card only, meaning often there were only 1 or 2 employees working. People could just check in, use the equipment, and leave. The whole facility pretty much managed itself. All entries, exits, and usage of equipment was processed digitally, so all I had to really do was sit in the office and keep an eye on the cameras. I would occasionally get up and walk around, do some light cleaning, and even talk to some of the guests. This was in a pretty bad part of town, but for the most part, everyone was nice and friendly, and it was one of those gyms where everyone kind of knows each other considering how few people really come in. This one night in particular, I was working from 8 p.m. until 6 a.m., which is generally a very long, boring shift, but everything that happened that night keeps me up at night to this day. It was around 2 a.m. when I had already done multiple rounds around the building and finished all routine paperwork. I was exhausted, so I just figured I'd sit down for a bit and monitor the cameras. Everything was normal at first. Not many people come in to work out in the middle of the night, but there were a couple regulars who came and went. I had worked here for a few months now, so almost everyone I recognized, except one man. I first noticed him when I saw him using a treadmill in the far corner. Normally this wouldn't catch my attention, as we have new guests from time to time. However, what really caught me off guard was how fast this man was running. I pulled up his treadmill number in the system, where I'm able to live monitor all equipment activity. He was running 9 miles per hour, which was impressive already, but what really shocked me was the fact that he never stopped. 10 minutes went by, then 15. He never slowed or stopped. I looked closer at the camera, and although I can't quite describe it in detail, this man was nothing short of unsettling. He was wearing ragged clothes, he had long, messy hair, and his face never moved once. He was just staring straight forward. Then I noticed his feet. He was barefoot. He had been running 9 miles per hour for 15 minutes barefoot, just staring into the distance. At this point in time, I was very weirded out, especially since he was now the only person in the building besides myself. I pulled myself together and realized that we do have a policy requiring shoes, so I decided I would use that as an excuse to go talk to him. Although his appearance really freaked me out, I got up the courage to leave the office and head out to talk to him. The machine he was on was located almost directly outside the employee hallway, and as soon as I turned that corner, my heart stopped. The treadmill was covered in blood. His feet were tearing apart as he ran. My heart dropped. Blood not only dripping, but splattering from his feet and ankles for every step he took. His face was still stone cold, staring straight ahead. His mouth was wide open as he ran. He looked like he was on every drug on the planet. At this point, I was terrified. He looked crazy enough to the point that my gut was telling me he was dangerous. However, I still mustered up the courage to yell at him to stop. I can't even remember exactly what I said, but I did have to raise my voice a bit so he would hear me over the thudding of his feet as he sprinted. He didn't say a word, or even turn his head for that matter. He just continued to sprint and stare forward with his mouth open. I yelled again, something along the lines of, "Hello, what are you doing?" He then muttered the words, "Are you there?" in the coldest, raspiest voice I've ever heard. He wasn't out of breath or even panting as he spoke. I told him to stop a few more times, and he repeatedly just said, "Are you there?" The pool of blood at the end of the conveyor was growing, and at this point, I just figured I'd call the cops. I went back to the office, picked up my phone, but before I called, I glanced at the monitors again. He was staring directly at the camera, sprinting, bleeding, mouth open, staring at the camera. I turned away and then heard him screaming from outside the door. He wasn't even screaming words, just screaming at the top of his lungs as he stared at me through the camera. Suddenly, he hopped off the treadmill. He didn't even turn it off, and he sprinted out of view of the camera. I immediately started clicking through the feed searching for him, but he was out of view of every camera we had in the building. I had checked every camera except one, the employee hallway. Sure enough, there he was, about 6 feet from the office door, just standing there. I don't even know how he had gotten into this hallway without a key card, but I didn't hesitate to quickly lock the door. Almost 5 seconds after I locked it, the doorknob rattled. Now I was calling the cops. He started screaming again and shaking the door as I explained to dispatch what was happening. They told me police were 5 minutes out, as I just waited in the corner of the office while this man was trying to get inside. His scream was terrifying. It was so deep it barely sounded human, and he kept it up for an unbelievably long time. This went on for about 3 minutes. I thought if he got in here I was gonna die, and I felt absolutely helpless. Suddenly though, the screaming stopped and the door didn't move. I checked the cameras again and he was gone. I couldn't see him anywhere. Eventually, the police arrived and I made them search the entire place before I would even leave the office. They told me he was nowhere to be found. I answered their questions and drove home. I quit the next day and have not entered that gym since. I have no idea what that man wanted or what kind of crazy he was. I still wonder what would have happened if I didn't lock that door.